Hello and welcome to our webinar today on a regional approach to zoning. My name is Toccarra Nicole Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of the Form-Based Codes Institute. And today we have a very august group with us. We have a very packed agenda, so I'll run through it really quickly. Just some quick housekeeping before we begin. Feel free to drop where you're from, your name, quick thing or what you're interested in, what drew you to today's webinar in the chat. Myself, Lisa Wise from Lisa Wise Consulting will be moderating the chat and responding to you in real time. We also will have a moderated chat towards the end of the webinar. And as I said, it's pretty packed today. So really quickly, I'll run through the webinar. I'm going through some housekeeping right now. I'll give you the welcome and introduction. Then we'll hear from our speakers about today's webinar. We'll hear from high-level regional approaches to zoning. We'll hear about from the team who actually wrote the form-based code. Here's some lessons learned in their approach. We'll hear from our jury chair, Peter Park, and he'll talk about the approach, why and how we selected today's winner. Then we'll round it out with the ceremonial awarding of the award for this year. And then we'll also have some form-based code Q&A towards the end. I'm very excited. So again, my name is Toccarra Nicole Thomas. I am the Director of Land Use and Development. And in that role at Smart Growth America, I also serve as the Executive Director of the Form-Based Codes Institute, which is a program of Smart Growth America. Smart Growth America envisions a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We empower communities through technical assistance, advocacy, and thought leadership to realize our vision of livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. We do that through our impact model. And we have three programmatic priorities: advancing racial equity, addressing climate change, and improving community health. The Form-Based Codes Institute has a mission of advancing zoning reform through the adoption of form-based codes. And we do our three product offerings: Form-Based Codes Education, Form-Based Code Awards. You're here today to hear more about that, where we highlight exemplary form-based codes, and then Codes for Communities, which is our technical assistance programs. Really quickly, the award is this is the 16th year, and we recognize communities in the writing and implementation of form-based codes. And each year, the jury of experts review submissions from code writers, designers, administrators, developers, and we evaluate those submissions against Form-Based Code Institute standards or practices. And with that, I'm just going to remind us again, feel free to drop information in the chat, drop your questions in the chat. The chat is being moderated and we will respond in real time. And I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speaker today, Ada Chan. Ada Chan is a regional planner with the Association of Bay Area Governments / Metropolitan Transportation Commission, where she works as part of the Regional Growth Framework team and has a background in working with neighborhoods, communities, and local jurisdictions in planning, affordable housing, and economic development. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ada.
Thank you so much. Can we load up the slides? Great. Thank you, Toccarra. As mentioned, my name is Ada Chan. I'm with the Association of Bay Area Governments and MTC. Next slide, please. We're the Metropolitan Planning Organization and the Council of Governments that are responsible for planning for the 9-county Bay Area and 100-city San Francisco Bay Area. Within that includes transportation planning, growth planning, and kind of working with the state and looking at population growth assignments. Next slide, please. So I was going to give a little bit of context in terms of what was happening in the housing landscape that got us to form-based code in California, and in particular in Marin. For those of you, I don't know if people remember what people's backgrounds are in terms of housing specifically, but if people remember in 2016, the Obama administration had issued a housing development toolkit in which they argued that kind of our housing inequality was bad for our economy as a country. It was kind of producing bad outcomes, and that it listed a bunch of policies that would remove the local barriers to housing. Within those were by right development, reducing parking requirements, and accessory dwelling units. Also, at that time period, we had seen a rise in homelessness. And in 2017, 2018, the UN had a special rapporteur on housing, specifically housing as a human right. And they visited California. And in their visit to some of our homeless encampments, essentially compared housing situation for some Californians to being worse than refugee camps in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. In 2016, what also came out was the McKinsey Institute issued a study, a toolkit to close California's housing gap. They talked about the need for us to build 3.5 million homes in 9 years. And again, talked about how the housing gap and inaffordability was an economic barrier to the state of California and an economic threat to our well-being in the long term. Next slide. In 2017, what also came out was the color of law. And this is just kind of the cultural landscape and what I started to see and what we all saw as kind of a reframing of housing in the country, and particularly in California. The color of law talked about kind of increased everyone's awareness of the racialization of land use and zoning. And not particular to anyone across the country, what we see and what we know now and is commonly understood is that single family zoning families that live in single family zoned areas have better outcomes, more wealth accrual. The zoning shows, and this could be any town USA, that on one side you see our single family home zone neighborhoods with trees, parks, amenities. And on the other side of the tracks, what you see is higher density housing, apartments, a lack of amenities, a lack of parks, and more importantly, what we know now is significantly, vastly different outcomes for the children that grow up in those neighborhoods. Next slide. So between 2016 and 2022, this is a rabbit hole I went down in preparing for this presentation. There were over 30 pieces of legislation in California specific to streamlining and ministerial approval of housing. This is not all the other planning related legislation. It is only legislation related to streamlining and ministerial approval. What we saw in 2016 was ADUs kind of became the language, and by right and ministerial approval of ADUs. That was the first time we kind of heard ministerial approval, but what we saw in 2017 was kind of a banner year with 15 pieces of housing legislation. Notable was SB 35. SB 35, Affordable Housing Streamlining Act, allowed multifamily housing in infill areas to be approved ministerially, required, not even allowed, required that it be approved ministerially. And it was linked very much to local jurisdictions meeting their housing goals. So if a jurisdiction wasn't performing on par, you would become responsible for approving ministerially multifamily housing that, two key points, met objective design standards, and you had a limited number of hearings that you were allowed to kind of subject that project to. This started to kind of, and then in 2021, I think there was also one other one. There was in 2020, the Housing Crisis Act again created this limited number of hearings kind of framework. And so what we see is increasingly over the 6-year period, kind of expansion of the areas in which local planners are expected to approve housing ministerially, do it as if they meet objective design standards. Two other ones that have happened more recently is SB 9, which is allowing single family home lots to be subdivided with 2 units on each lot. And then again, with ministerial approval and a need for objective design standards. And then AB 2011, most recently passed, is allowing residential housing in commercial zoned areas. So, local planners are I experience this as relentless, and I am not a local planner. But 6 years of continuously having to kind of adapt zoning codes to meet these kind of changes and have objective design standards that they can move these projects with. Next slide. So another part of the context is that as the COG, we're responsible for addressing growth and helping the state number kind of be spread throughout the region. And one of the situations is, as you can see here, for 30 years, we have had growth projections from the state that are increasingly declining. And part of the housing crisis and resulted in all of that legislation resulted in a kind of a recalibration in terms of how the state configured this number and assigned this number. And what happened to us, it happens every 8 years, but this year, our number as a region more than doubled. And so our local planners, on top of all that change, are having to do their housing elements and rezone to kind of meet a much higher number. And part of why this is critical is because if you remember SB 35, if you are not producing housing kind of on par with that assignment, which is now doubled, and we have never met the housing, as you can see from the numbers on the right, we have never met those goals, then you are responsible for approving certain projects by right ministerially. And so the objective design standards that you're holding those projects to become critical. So yes, so the RENA assignment and just so many changes that are happening in California right now. Next slide.
In about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So what this means for local jurisdictions is that we need to design objective design standards, processes and procedures need to be streamlined. And so local planners are having to come up with all of these processes. And really the objective design and development codes are critical. Next slide. So what the state has done is they've committed $900 million to local planning grants and local jurisdictions to assist with planning for housing. But when that gets spread between all of the jurisdictions, it's a very tight amount of money and a lot of reporting and a lot of applying. Next slide. But it is a commitment to helping jurisdictions plan for housing. Next slide. So our role as as the regional government was to really think about what could we do to help local jurisdictions. And in 2018, when SB 35 had passed, we called together a group of consultants and jurisdictions to ask, could people imagine regional objective design standards that the regional government could develop and local jurisdictions could adapt? And pretty much across the board, the answer was no. HCD was interested. Jillian was in the room and Opticos was in the room. We had a few crazy folks who thought it was possible. But at that time, MTC and ABAG did not have the funding to pursue this. Next slide. We knew that there were challenges for existing communities, and particularly those communities that have the quality of life that everybody aspires to. And that the challenge to local government was not developing the design guidelines, but getting your communities there. And that for us as the regional government, we might be able to do the design work and work with Opticos, but really who was going to do this heavy load of bringing jurisdictions, bringing elected officials along, right? And bringing neighborhoods along. Next slide. But what we saw as an opportunity is helping communities like set their expectations and working with their planning staff to say, this is what we want. And hopefully, with objective design standards, would we be able to help people get that? So we're so, I can't, it's a phenomenal effort and leadership that was provided by the County of Marin staff. It was something we could not imagine given the responses we got. And just to say, with their leadership, the regional government is now doing, in MTC ABAG, we're now using our funding to work with Opticos to try to do something similar, if we could do as well as you all did in Marin, for the whole region. And we hope that we'll be able to do something, I'm no Jillian. So, but it's been a phenomenal effort in terms of alignment of resources, individuals with political will, individuals with technical capacity to bring this together. And it's something we're so excited to have come out of the Bay Area. I'd like to introduce Peter, who's going to tell you a little bit more about this project. Peter Park is the director owner of Peter Park LLC, a city planning and design practice based in Denver that provides strategic advising services to civic leadership, informed by his experience as a city planning director. His integrated approach to comprehensive planning, urban design, and development review has resulted in clear visions for sustainable urban development places of high quality design, streamlined development permitting systems. Peter is an FBCI steering committee member and teaches FBC 101 courses for the second year in a row. He chaired FBCI's Form-Based Code Award jury and will share his remarks on this year's winner.
Thank you, Ada. And thank you, Ada, for setting up this conversation, participating today, but also, right, helping to bring the words objective design standards to the forefront, right? And so today I'm going to share with you some of the jury's perspective of why we chose this entry, and can tell you that, you know, the FBCI Awards, we had a lot of entries from across the country, from both coasts and from the middle of the country, large cities, small cities, counties. And we're seeing just generally a better sort of raising of the bar of the quality of our form-based codes. And one of the things that this code in particular and this approach offered was one of the criteria that we look at is, does the code offer features that advance the practice? And we think that this is really one of those exemplary models. It really builds upon the differentiating strengths of form-based codes, that is providing clear guidance for better design outcomes, using objective standards that are predictable, fair, and lead to timely reviews. And so a noteworthy contribution of this work in particular is its transferability and adaptability, right? As a regulatory construct, the standards that you would find in these codes, in this code, allow for a lot of creative freedom from a design perspective, because they focus on the basic objective design elements that address how buildings relate to the environment, how buildings relate to other buildings, and importantly, how they define the public realm. And what this team has done is create an innovative and design-forward open source toolkit, right? I mean, the thing that's amazing, I think, that the jury's discussed is, you know, in zoning for a long time, we have, in form-based practice, we've really focused on, you know, the nature of the essence of the local place. And in this work, this team has skillfully married the technique of form-based code and a methodology for understanding the nuances of local community patterns, but also creating it in a way that creates a toolkit that makes form-based code and application of form-based codes much more accessible, and especially for communities that might not have as many resources or a lot of staff, you know, to take on a major code rewrite and update. So we really think that this is one of those examples of a code that, for those of you in California, help to implement your state mandates, and importantly, confidently move away from time-consuming review processes to facilitate greater housing capacity and diversity and achieve higher design outcomes, right? So many of us are working in communities that are struggling with development pressures, are challenged with housing capacity and design quality. The second thing that's particularly exemplary is it really is a model of multi-jurisdictional cooperation in the way that these communities came together, pooled the resources, so that you know, they have you know, in zoning and in fights between communities that sometimes happen on land use, right? We think this is a terrific example of how this place-based approach actually creates a way for communities to cooperate further and create local and regional competitiveness by having a understandable and accessible set of standards. So this really is an exemplary interjurisdictional approach, and is promising for regions across our country to cut through restrictive regulations and complicated review processes that so often limit housing supply and increase housing costs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jillian Zeiger, a senior planner with the county in Marin. And she's going to give us the big picture view of how the scope of work was developed and how it was approved. It's pretty exciting. Jillian.
Thanks, Peter. So since December 2018, county staff have been convening the housing working group at the county of Marin. And this is a collaborative that's composed of planning directors and senior staff from all of the jurisdictions in Marin County. And we meet and coordinate on housing issues since most jurisdictions don't have dedicated housing staff. It really started as a place to discuss and interpret state legislation, including the huge list of legislation that Ada showed in her slide, because those are just the streamlining acts. There's tons of others that we all had to interpret and continue to interpret together. So in January 2019, after I met with Ada and others, including Opticos, I started a conversation about collaborating on projects for a state planning grant, which is California's SB2 planning grant, one of the grants that Ada mentioned. So each jurisdiction received a certain amount of money, but we quickly realized that it wasn't enough funds to do one complete project, like one complete quality project for each jurisdiction. So I convinced the jurisdictions to collaborate on 3 projects together, one of which was the Objective Design and Development Standards project. I don't think we would have collaborated on this project to the extent that we did if we didn't have the grant dollars. They afforded us the opportunity to work on this document together. So as someone with a design background, I've created design guidelines, streetscape standards, et cetera. I created a first draft of the scope to review with the jurisdictions, but it was really a collaborative process. The planning directors were on the selection panel and contributed to the scope. And I helped each jurisdiction apply for the state funds. We wanted to make sure we had uniform scope and timeline. And I worked with the state to let them know that we were collaborating. And I was able to answer specific questions from the state. And also my colleagues at the county or I attended every council meeting where this grant application was presented so that we could answer questions about the collaborative project and bring our support to the planning directors and planning staff when they were presenting this project at council meetings. I am going to come back and talk a little bit more later, but I wanted to mention that the scope was kind of written as a base scope, which is the collaborative project that led to the toolkit that's being discussed today. And we also allowed jurisdictions to the option of adding services to further customize the toolkit for their code. And I think this was also instrumental in receiving initial buy-in. The jurisdictions wanted the option of having a consultant guide them through the entire process, from presenting the base toolkit to adoption, and having the flexibility of customization really helped our process. I will say that we were met with a bit of skepticism from the state that we wouldn't be able to get the project done together with the funds and on the allocated timeline we suggested. So I'm really proud to be here presenting with these jurisdictions and Opticos today. So now I'm going to introduce the Opticos team. So Tony Perez, he's a senior associate at Opticos Design. He leads the code reform team at Opticos, working with public sector planners and communities across the US to understand, customize, and apply form-based codes. Since 2000, Tony has authored, co-authored, or peer-reviewed dozens of codes for neighborhoods, downtowns, suburban shopping center transformations, and citywide. And prior to 2000, Tony worked as a public sector planner in Southern California for 13 years. And Stefan Pellegrini, who's a principal at Opticos Design, where he works with planners and departments across the public sector to solve complex housing problems. As an architect, urban designer, and planner himself, Stefan brings an invaluable perspective advocating for equitable design in communities big and small across America. In addition to his work at Opticos, Stefan shares a love for education, having taught at University of California, Berkeley, as well as speaking at institutions around the world. His leadership in both in the classroom and the firm have been essential to introducing missing middle housing to cities across America. So take it away, Stefan and Tony.
Thanks, Jillian. I'm going to get things started here for our team and then pass the mic over to Tony, but really thrilled to be part of this amazing group today and talk about our work in Marin. Next slide, please. So just Ada gave everybody sort of an introduction to the Bay Area geography. For those who may not be familiar, Marin County is one of the 9 counties in the San Francisco Bay regional area. And we did this project with 11 jurisdictions out of 10 who agreed to sort of participate with the county. The largest city, San Rafael, determined to create their own objective design standards. Marin County is directly across from San Francisco, just north across the Golden Gate Bridge. It's largely a rural county. There are about 265,000 people across about 800 square miles of land area. In 2019, however, it actually, I believe, was the 6th wealthiest county in the United States. And so that sort of puts things into context and sort of underlines the need for housing and attainable housing to be built in Marin. All of the jurisdictions really were unique, and they consider themselves sort of to be unique. But I think lucky for us, they shared many physical characteristics. And they are predominantly sort of lower intensity places made up of lower intensity neighborhoods. But many had sort of a small historic downtown that their communities that were organized around. And this became a good launch point for understanding how we actually could share a regulatory approach. Next slide, please. So there were sort of 2 key things that we sort of did ramping up to our work on the actual code in collaboration with the planning directors. The first one was an existing conditions analysis where we asked the jurisdictions to contribute information they had on the places in their communities where they were expecting housing to go. Most of this work had sort of been done at the comprehensive plan level and the housing element, which is sort of an important component of comprehensive plans in the state of California. But we aggregated a group of about 750 distinct parcels across those 11 jurisdictions that were the jurisdictions were anticipating that housing would go. And we put that work into sort of a series of preliminary buckets to understand the physical characteristics and how those sort of could be organized, understanding that the sort of lexicon, how they were zoned, their land use designations across the different jurisdictions were actually all different. And we use that information then to sort of follow with an atlas that we refer to as the Place Types and Building Types Atlas. The atlas actually looked at physical characteristics of places, things that we gleaned and learned from the existing conditions analysis. And it was sort of a way and a sort of a consideration, a mechanism to ensure that existing places where this housing would go would preserve desired characteristics that could be identified. And it also sort of was an avenue for jurisdictions to think about when they were expanding a geography for new housing into new parts of their community, what those places actually initially should be like. This was sort of an important component because most of this thought actually happened in comprehensive plans. But this work actually that was sort of requiring an additional layer of housing to be built through sort of these new RENA allocations that Ada mentioned, meant that cities sort of needed to kind of figure a way to kind of bypass or an alternate way to actually consider and envision what new places in the community would look like when this housing would be created. Important component of this was this idea that we needed to be able to sort of test what could happen on these parcels. And Tony will sort of talk a little bit about that sort of moving forward, but this needed to sort of deal with not only the physical capacity of the zoning, but to sort of gain a sort of a strong understanding of actually what the sort of market would support to a sort of in order to align the zoning with sort of the reality of market conditions. So the Place Types Atlas really sort of provides an overview of Marin's DNA. And I like to refer to it as a Rosetta Stone because it was a document that actually communicated to the jurisdictions where they had similarities with other jurisdictions, provided an underpinning for them to actually share sort of these regulatory tools. There's just sort of a couple things I sort of want to touch on here. One is that it sort of needed to provide a mechanism to match desired form and intensity with housing need. And the way this sort of came through is in the transect zones that actually form a basis for the zoning toolkit. But it needed to make sure that, again, new housing was going to sort of match up with the form and intensity of character of the different places in these communities. The other thing I sort of had mentioned previously is that there was some work that needed to be done to relate that form and intensity to the selected geography of where housing was going to go. And communities, based on what they had, were making different decisions about that geography. Some of them are sort of pointing towards existing Main Street downtown environments, expecting sort of mixed use housing over retail and services environments to actually be implemented in those areas. Other places were more interested in neighborhoods and how neighborhoods could be intensified to actually encourage additional housing. Other jurisdictions, in trying to meet their RHNA allocation, were looking at places where actually there hadn't been a consideration of what those places should be like. And the Place Types Atlas, again, provided an opportunity for them to actually think about the quality and character of those places without the benefit of a sort of visioning process. There's other work at the place types level that actually needed to actually talk about character and architectural style, understanding that we needed to sort of try to create a palette of different architectural approaches that would sort of reflect actually what was existing in the jurisdictions, but that jurisdictions would have different needs that needed to be met and would have different desires to actually for individual expression, architectural style that they would sort of need to be able to be empowered to select through the toolkit process. So the next slide sort of provides kind of a summary of sort of how that works. The nomenclature here that you see is sort of a reflection of the existing conditions analysis and this need to sort of create this Rosetta Stone that would sort of put all of the jurisdictions sort of into a common language. So the existing conditions analysis established context types that you sort of see here at the top, from edge, suburban to core. The Place Types Atlas actually established a series of distinct places along a spectrum of neighborhoods, corridors, and centers. And you can see sort of the initial alignment with the transect zones that would sort of become the foundation and framework for the toolkit that Tony's going to talk a little bit more about. And you can see how those sort of align to implement the different places that are sort of directly above those transect zones. So now I'm going to sort of pass the mic over to Tony. He's going to talk about the process for site testing and some of the guidance that sort of got us to thinking about the content in the toolkit.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So with that understanding in place of the place types and the three contexts where the different place types occurred, we had a really good understanding of where housing was possible or expected or both. And that gave us the go-ahead on starting to work with cities, individual jurisdictions on testing their expectations or the directives from the state in terms of the housing numbers you heard Ada talk about. Just what does each of the jurisdictions have to achieve and where? And let's start figuring that out. And that helped us in terms of the standards that we needed to start considering and the types of zones that we'd need to write for these jurisdictions. But it also helped the communities in their conversations with their community and their elected officials, precisely, comparing the change in the new standards compared to how they're doing business today. That's a huge conversation, especially in Marin County. Next slide. And so with that understanding, we understood it from a technical standpoint and from our observations. Then we worked with the cities on the site testing. And after that, we had a very solid understanding of the kinds of zoning districts and standards that they would need to carry out the development that now we understood across the different jurisdictions. And some needed the whole spread here, like the unincorporated county is probably using all 8 of these zones. And some of the smaller towns are using maybe 3 of the zones, and some of the other cities are using 5 of the zones. None of them are using all except the county, but what you see here is the menu of everything they do need. And so they can select the zones and the standards that fit their objectives and needs. Next slide. And by the way, those zones range from 2 to 4 stories primarily, up to 6 stories at the very top there. And so that information then gave us the basis to wrap everything around it into a toolkit. And I love the term toolkit. This idea that the county had in the beginning, and then working with Stefan under his leadership, just how all this came together. And the toolkit is basically this it's a kit of parts, but at the chapter level, and then at the section level inside the chapters. And so we would sit down with each of the jurisdictions, and once having gone this far with them, we could advise them on the kind of information and content that would address the kind of concerns that we had come to know they needed. And we worked back and forth on that. Sometimes it was removal of literally a section, removal of a chapter, sometimes it was addition of a section, modification of some content, but it was their selection. You could see the 3 chapters that are just, you can't do without, but the others are optional. They had the choice. Next slide. And I want to call a couple of these to your attention. So the building type chapter, it works in concert with the zone standards. The zone standards do a great job of identifying the zoning envelope for these towns and cities. And then from that zoning envelope, the applicant is directed to choose a building type. And they come here, and we're showing you the multiplex as an example. They come here, and that multiplex's height and footprint and width and everything else is further refined from what the zoning envelope allows because of where the multiplex is allowed. It's different for, say, a cottage court or, say, a Main Street building. But those building type standards that refine what the zoning envelope allows for where it's allowed. The next step is on the right-hand side of this slide. The applicant then chooses one of those massing types. So you've got your refined building type, an overall footprint and volume, and now you choose one of the massing types to articulate that massing in ways that are compatible for the context where it's allowed to be. Next slide. And then they select one of the 6 architectural styles that we documented in Marin County. And I have to say, as code writers, we don't often recommend our regulating architectural style for a lot of reasons, namely cost and just complexity and everything else. But in an objective standard scenario, and as in California, if you can't say anything reviewing the project, you're going to need it on paper. And so the cities and jurisdictions said, we want to go there. And so this is one example of that, and just quickly saying that not everything you see on the page is regulated. It's rather the opposite. It's the essential elements of each architectural style were regulated so that only the essential elements are needed to demonstrate that style when people see it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so 2 more slides here very quickly. The progress, you can see there, you can read that for yourselves in the interest of time. But overall, it took us a year from the start in terms of getting everything and understanding existing conditions, all the things that Stefan talked about, working with the different jurisdictions. We had several sessions with their planning directors working group that the county set up. That was really invaluable to talk back and forth and understand each other and get this on a solid foundation. And in the year that we delivered the customized toolkit for Marin, and then we started the process of working individually with them to customize it further for themselves. Next, last slide. And so now we are applying this approach. We've been hired in 2 other regions to do a similar project. In Puget Sound, Washington, we just finished the place type work, or just finishing it, and we'll start the toolkit work in February, and that's for 3 counties and 82 cities. And that toolkit is focused on missing middle only. So basically 2 to 3 story development in the Puget Sound region. And then here with Ada Chan in San Francisco for the ABAG region, 9 counties, 107 cities. So we are just starting that work this month. So thank you for your time today. I'm going to introduce now Adam Wolf. I've got to work with Adam in Corte Madera, and let me read you his fancy bio here. Adam Wolf, town manager, town of Corte Madera. He's the town manager in Corte Madera, Marin County, California, where he oversees all town operations and staff. Adam previously served as the town's director of planning and building for 8 years, leading the town's land use planning and development review processes. Prior to returning to the area of Northern California where he was raised, Adam spent almost 15 years in New York City, where he obtained a master's in urban planning from Columbia University and began his career as a city planner, eventually serving as deputy director of New York City's Manhattan office of the Department of City Planning from 2009 to 14. Welcome.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Congratulations to both you, Tony, and Stefan, and really the entire Opticos team for this award. And really thanks to Smart Growth America for highlighting this work and promoting smart planning nationwide. So, you know, I think a lot has already been said. I'm going to touch on some of it, but certainly I just wanted to start by saying when this concept of developing a sort of this regional form-based code, or the objective design and development standards was first floated, and a lot of credit does go to Jillian for bringing this idea to the countywide planning directors group at the time. You know, I, for one, I certainly was pretty skeptical that it could be done. As I think Stefan mentioned, we're first and foremost talking about a large geographic area with varied topographies and natural built and built conditions, and really that alone seemed to present pretty significant challenges. And maybe 2, most importantly, partly because of the way that development occurred in Marin, with most communities sort of tucked into valleys and separated from each other by hills and open space. As Stefan mentioned, every city really thinks of itself having its own distinct character and urban form, and is really proud of this. And this mentality sometimes, I think, can influence the politics of a process like this. One that really tries to highlight the commonalities of existing conditions and common approaches toward achieving better development patterns moving forward. But really, after listening to Opticos's approach, and I was part of the sort of the selection committee that Jillian put together, and looked at some of their previous work, and for me, really, Stefan and Tony, it was the work in Virginia that I think you had done previously. It became more clear that this could work, and Ada, you touched on 2 additional factors that I think really were influential in making this a reality, having the new state laws that basically force cities and towns to consider what by right zoning would mean for their communities. And when I looked at my zoning code in Corte Madera, that really meant that there were basically little to no rules for new multifamily housing development in town. And you know, that by right situation was going to be problematic if we had a new development proposed in Corte Madera with no sort of community input and really no regulations that could sort of create the predictable urban form and good design in streets, you know, sort of the walkable urban community that we expected and wanted our community to have. So secondly, I do think as well, and Jillian, I think you discussed this, maybe it was you, Ada, but having the financial assistance from state grants for local planning efforts certainly made our conversations with local decision makers about participation in this effort much easier. And then it really, Jillian, it wouldn't have happened if not for your work at sort of the county level, bringing us all together and facilitating the process throughout. And so for Corte Madera, early on, certainly staff recognized local benefits. We actually had policy in our comprehensive plan that spoke for the need for more design guidelines, not necessarily objective standards, but design guidelines for mixed use development and multifamily housing. But we hadn't done it. It was sitting there as part of our comprehensive plan, but we never got around to it. So we knew this was going to fit right into our policy goals and objectives, though. But we definitely felt we needed to ensure that other members of the community who were going to be important stakeholders in actually adopting all or portions of the toolkit also understood the benefits and had input into its development, ultimately could vouch for the process and the work that was done. So we convened our first meeting of what we called the Technical Advisory Working Group in October of 2019. And that merged sort of some technical expertise from our community, as well as some political expertise. And so we had a local architect that would have to use the standards. We had a multifamily housing developer on our group that could provide input and push back if we were getting too prescriptive or requiring things that would add significant cost. We had another planner that worked in another city that had recently adopted form-based codes. We had a resident who was actually active in the community, but also happened to live next to in a condo project next to a recently completed multifamily housing project. And so could provide that perspective of how infill housing could or should take into account existing residents. And we had a planning commissioner and a town council member who were well-versed in design on that committee. And so periodically at key junctures, we'd meet with this group in Opticos and have the working group provide feedback, comments on the draft documents, and provide their own perspectives on important considerations, which I think ultimately helped lend legitimacy to Opticos's work and started, I think, to really show how we could tweak the toolkit and adapt it to local needs and conditions. And that was really critical to have that understanding from this group that we had flexibility and we could still tailor it to our needs in our town as compared to maybe somewhere else. So we modified actually the toolkit in several ways and adopted the toolkit in a new title of our municipal code in December of 2021. And really it was limited in sort of the applicability at the outset, just in areas where state laws precluded the town, again, from otherwise using discretionary review process such as design review. But as Ada discussed, that means more and more every year, there's more of these types of projects that are we don't have discretion on. And so this is becoming more applicable each year. For example, I'll just point out one, the T3 zone, which, and we adopted T3 zone standards and the duplex and house building typologies with some minor modifications for projects that would be constructed pursuant to the much talked about, like the SB9 projects, which allow single family home lots to be split and then duplexes to be constructed. We also did not adopt the architectural design chapter. We're using those actually as design guidelines because our group and staff felt that that flexibility for design work would still come as long as the basics of the toolkit and what was trying to be achieved elsewhere was actually required. And importantly for Corte Madera, we worked with Opticos to create specific development standards for floodplain development because essentially half our town and multifamily development would be located, new development was surely going to be located in the floodplain. And so there are some standards related to either landscaping up to the design flood elevation or actually how to screen parking garages under a development. Happy to say we're now using our toolkit to inform and facilitate additional changes to our zoning code. And we actually used several of the objective standards in the toolkit and recently adopted zonings for several sites intended to facilitate new higher density housing development as part of our actual housing element update, which was one of our objectives at the beginning of this process. So it's going to be continue really to be a great asset, I see it, for our future planners over time. Thanks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Brown, Principal Sustainable Community Planning. Bob Brown was a planning director in several Bay Area cities during his 40-year career, including San Rafael, Novato, and Palo Alto, and San Mateo. He began sustainability programs in his agencies, prepared model green building codes, and was an instructor on sustainable development at Dominican University. He is currently assisting cities adopt objective development standards and building electrification codes. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Adam. As Adam said, I'm sort of filling a role as liaison recently between staff and Opticos in adopting their toolkit and customizing it to local standards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the nitty-gritty about that implementation process and also some of the challenges that I've experienced along the way there. And I'll try to be quick to make up a little time today. So as has been noted, customization is really needed to incorporate only those portions of the toolkit that relate to a community's size and overall character of their built environment. But as Ada points out, it's also critical that we look ahead to these higher densities that we have to accommodate thanks to the state and how the toolkit can address those. So again, it's a flexible document in that sense, which really is important. So in customizing, you really need to identify the jurisdiction's existing code regulations that you still want to remain in force, and which of those would be superseded by the odds. And then that's kind of a detailed process. But it takes a significant amount of effort and back and forth with staff, and that includes dealing with the city engineers and fire marshals, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. So the customization process is also all about determining how far your agency wants to go in mandating sort of the finer details of a project design. As Tony with Opticos says, you can dial up or dial down the level of prescriptiveness of the odds based upon your community's desires. And again, that's a great aspect of the toolkit. You can pick and choose. And as has been mentioned, the toolkit, for example, includes some very detailed architectural standards. And some jurisdictions have chosen to adopt those, and others are going to rely only on the building form and let architects sort of have their way with the facade treatments. Another example that's important here in Marin is the extent to which slope restrictions should apply. And those need to be refined based upon the local topography and also on the past development patterns in a community. I'm working in Sausalito, which historically has been pretty much all hillside development. So we need to factor that in. Touching on a few challenges, I think the most significant, frankly, is the availability of staff in these smaller communities to work with Opticos on that customization. Most smaller towns have eliminated their long-range planning functions over time. And so they don't really have the ability to work on major ordinance upgrades. So that's where I've come in to try to help fill that gap and essentially function as an internal staff member. Another big challenge that we've talked about are the California's housing element requirements. Ada talked a lot about that. In Marin, we're having to deal with a proposed 12% increase in housing units over the next 8 years here in a county that we thought was largely built out. Surprise, surprise. So that's going to result in higher densities and building volumes. And so those have to be reflected in the odds. Again, the toolkit provides a means of doing that. Another problem is with the California laws is that despite all this effort to go and really refine and adopt good objective standards, a developer can get an unlimited number of waivers to those odd standards through the state density bonus law, if they include a percentage of affordable units. So it's sort of a get out of jail free card, which undermines our work. And I think in the long run, it's going to infuriate the public and undermine their confidence in these design standards when some of these projects that should comply with the odds, but don't have to, or get built. Most of the communities that I'm aware of are adopting odds to only apply to new multi-unit projects that are required under these state laws to be reviewed under objective standards. So what you'll end up with is essentially the city having two parallel zoning codes. One that applies to single family or non-residential or additions and alterations that don't add 2 or more units, and then the odds code that applies to these state qualified projects. So that entails additional staff training and familiarity with two very different form-based, two different code types. And so I imagine some agencies, frankly, once they gain experience in using the form-based code, are probably going to come around and adopt it universally. But I think that's going to sort of be a process that will take place over time. And lastly, I found that while planners are starting to finally come around to accepting this new world of limited design discretion, I think I found it's been a harder pill for city engineers and fire marshals. Most codes basically allow public works and fire standards to be established or modified based on their professional safety judgment on a project by project basis, which doesn't fly in this new objective world. And some of the typical fire requirements like wide driveways and large building setbacks for their fire access do conflict with the odds design objectives. So maybe the state will restrict those opportunities as well for fire agencies. We'll see. But having said that, despite these challenges, I really think that the Opticos code offers a detailed and best of all, a time-tested set of objective standards in this new era of development review. So let me hand this back to Jillian, who needs no further introduction.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of how we coordinated this project. So I think other speakers have mentioned this, so I'll keep it short. The key to coordinating a countywide effort of this nature, I think, is to have one point person who's shepherding the process along. So I met with the Opticos team weekly, and I sent summary emails to the jurisdictions. And I also made myself open to meet with the jurisdictions one-on-one to discuss any issues or answer questions. But the other key aspect of the coordination was meeting with all the planning directors at really critical points in the process to not only get their approval on phases of the project, but to clarify next step. So we modified the scope a few times during the process because of this and these meetings and talking about next steps. And I think that only created a stronger project. As I said earlier, the scope was written so that jurisdictions could opt into additional services. And I think that's really key. As you heard from Adam and Bob, we did the toolkit together, but jurisdictions did site testing and technical case studies. And so, as we know, all jurisdictions have different zoning codes and different expectations. So they would need to be tailored. It's not a one size fits all situation. And I think having that expectation at the outset is important. The Opticos team was composed of Opticos and Lisa Wise Consulting and Plan to Place. And I think it was key to having the entire team coordinate on this project because especially with Plan to Place, the outreach language and events that were done in, some of the specific jurisdictions had consistent messaging. And we also had a countywide website to point to. And we also did countywide outreach products that were helpful, such as a countywide survey. And Lisa's team was very familiar with codes of several jurisdictions. And that was a critical piece as well to help adapt for specific jurisdictions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Toccarra.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much to everybody who spoke on the panel. As you all might see, the Q&A is very robust. And I'll play moderator. I'll throw out some questions. They might be targeted to some attendees directly, or they might be a general overall question. So we'll start with some of the questions in the Q&A. We've been answering them, but if there's anything that anybody feels beholden to answer a little bit more detailed, please jump in. It's a general question. One question that I felt could probably have a little bit more detail. How do zoning and property taxation relate to each other? To the extent that Proposition 13 keeps property taxes low, particularly on land, does this thwart development of infill sites for housing or commercial purposes?
I mean, I can start. just by saying that in Marin County, there are so many factors that have limited development. And I think this is one of them. But I mean, the cost of land in general, I think when I see pro formas from developers, especially affordable housing developers, they actually don't have to pay property taxes or not at the same rate as other developers. So this isn't as big of a constraint. And I think the market rate developers build that cost into their pro forma, and it's just a cost of development.
I guess
would
I would,
Oh, go ahead, Bob.
I guess I would say, Prop 13 came in 1978. And I think probably for a couple of decades, most cities realized they really were going to chase retail and other tax generating uses to the expense of housing. But I think over time, the last couple of decades, we've realized, the housing shortfall is real. And these new state laws were the result of that. And I think now, there's just no other alternative but to plan for and approve housing.
I will say just real quick, because I do think it does affect, as you noted, Bob, some of the development, or a lot of people turn to retail. And what I see is happening is that a lot of the older retail establishments, which are locally owned, they're not flipping into, they're not changing hands. And so you don't see a lot of actual turnover in available properties that people want to make available for redevelopment because of Prop 13 and the low taxes that people who own those properties can pay on them over time, and still, have relatively functioning retail that produces revenue on a yearly basis. So in that standpoint, I think it does limit redevelopment opportunities to a certain extent.
But the good news is, having overbuilt retail, we now have a lot of sites that can be turned into housing.
If we can motivate people to actually utilize those sites and put them into play there. Yeah.
Thank you for that. This one is for the design team. And so Opticos and Jillian and Bob, what's one thing you would change next time?
I think from my perspective, not trying to customize the odds in the middle of a housing element update. The housing element process has created such tumult that hitching the odds to that process has been very challenging.
Really quickly, Bob, follow up on that. Do you want to give a little bit of context for the housing element? Because we took a look at the analytics and we have attendees from almost all across the globe. So maybe take a little bit of time, or maybe Ada, you can join in about the housing element and then kind of come back to that and expound upon that thought a little more.
Well, as we've said, the housing element requirements are causing us to have to plan for much denser projects, larger developments, size-wise than previously. And so, to have adopted the odds based upon, our existing land use policies, I think would have been much easier and digestible in our communities. But again, having to modify them now to incorporate higher density zones than what they've seen in the past is difficult to swallow. And so we're sort of being drawn into that whole housing element controversy as a result.
If I could just tag on to that, we're working, for example, in Marin County and Sausalito, the city of Sausalito, with Bob helping us there. That's essentially a hillside community. And the numbers that the state and the city agreed to, or I would say the city eventually agreed to what the state was saying in terms of housing production targets for them, they are, those processes could be informed by a more physical approach, like what we're talking about here, because we get to the table and those numbers have been decided. And a lot of times there's nuance to them, but a lot of times, I would say more often than not, there is not nuance. It's some spreadsheet and somebody takes the developable area and says, that sounds pretty good. And then that number now gets forced onto us as the regulating code writers to implement. And a lot of times we have tough news to deliver to the planning director to say, I don't know, in order to do that, here's what that building is going to look like. And so we've had those conversations. And in terms of what that's going to look like, I mean, it's bigger than you expected. And then selling that to the neighbors. So the housing element process needs to have more nuance and more information than it currently does.
Yeah, I was thinking about it this morning and thinking about, you fly over at 30,000 feet, it's just a bunch of squares and pegs and just trying to make them fit. But then you add a slope, water access, right? And it becomes this. So we're in the process of this huge culture change. And we're planners, or at least I am. And planning has a lot longer horizon than the expected change of legislators. And so just what it's going to do to bring our communities along is I really admire all of you guys.
That's high praise coming from Ada Chan, everybody. This one is a fresh one from the Q&A from the other Bob Brown who's in the chat. Can the goals of form-based codes be achieved by revising the Euclidean code without some of the complexities of a form-based code? And I'll ask Peter to start us for that, your thoughts on that one. And then maybe everyone can just jump in after Peter has a crack at the apple.
Sure. Wow. My first response is no, I don't think so. Fundamentally, because the evolution of form-based codes was to counter many of the problems that Euclidean codes that are just embedded in Euclidean codes. So while Euclidean codes might be more familiar to folks, which might make form-based codes seem complex, in fact, form-based codes that are done well actually bring more certainty and clarity to what the regulations are for, and actually expand really how well and how much you can regulate, especially with regard to building form and creating successful walkable urban places.
Thank you, Peter. Adam, it looks like you came off of mute.
It just sparked a thought of one of the actual contradictions I think in sort of how this works is that, you know, form-based codes really are obviously they're about the form and how it meets the street and overall a certain character that you're trying to achieve in future development. The problem, and this is where I think state legislation again, and you talk about housing element, they require us to use units per acre as a density metric when we're trying to actually, which is sort of kind of counter to the idea of creating really focusing on the form of a building. And so there is a conflict there with some of that I think needs to be addressed moving forward and how we go about if we're going to be using objective standards and form-based codes in the future. I think it speaks to Bob's point about the density bonus as well and all the things you can get sort of the exceptions to the standards through the density bonus. That's again based on units per acre, not based on any sort of objective form discussion. So anyways.
And so, Adam, really quickly, I'll respond to that. Even though I'm supposed to play moderator and not insert my thoughts, right? But it sounds like there's a conflict between the state laws and the state changes in the current Euclidean zoning and form-based codes. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, amazing that it might actually work that way. But yes, there's some challenges with how the legislation comes down and how we have to work with it on the ground level to try to achieve the development patterns that I think as planners we want to achieve and for our communities. So
thank you. And Stefan, one more answer for this one, and then we'll wrap up with one more and then the ending of the webinar.
Yeah, thanks. The comment I wanted to make is I think that a lot of communities who have really good bones can actually get good infill projects with maybe even without a form-based code. And what's happened in California, particularly with sort of the increase in the regional housing allocations, is that a lot of cities now actually have to make choices about putting housing into environments where there is none or there never has been. So from the Euclidean standpoint, they might make a decision to say, we're going to make housing an allowed use in a commercial zone. And so then you have to ask that question, what do you get if you have a housing project that is being introduced into a strip mall or a shopping mall or an auto row? And what kind of place are you trying to get? sort of out of that. And I think what we found here is that we didn't really start this process talking about a form-based code, but the need to actually be able to talk about what that place type outcome is really sort of got everybody thinking in that direction sort of as the project sort of moved forward. And that's, I think, something that a lot of jurisdictions across the United States are grappling with right now. This need to actually start thinking about how to put housing into communities that are not the two places where they actually have put them historically. And that's sort of a big challenge that we sort of tried to address with the toolkit.
Thank you, Stefan. And our last question from the Q&A, how do you overcome opposition from builders and architects to adopting objective standards that are very prescriptive as required by law? We're getting pushback that these limit creativity. And Bob, I'll look at you first to answer that one.
Yeah, definitely the case. You know, and I don't have any great answers. I mean, one thing I've done is in one case where an architect was pushing back, I went and actually did a plan check of one of his recently approved projects against the form-based code to point out to him that even not knowing those standards, for the great majority of the design aspects, it complied. So again, a good architect designing good buildings, it's amazing that they're going to be pretty close to these standards. But really, you know, the bottom line issue is that, you know, we have to have objective standards. And so I always would just throw this back on the architect saying, you know, if not these, then what? You know, we can no longer use, you know, just general design review to sort of work these things out in a back and forth manner. So I don't have a perfect answer for that, but yes, there are architects that really feel that we're trotting on their creativity.
Jillian and Adam.
Go ahead, Jillian.
Yeah, and Adam is probably going to say something similar because Adam and the unincorporated county, and I think other jurisdictions too, had stakeholder groups who reviewed the toolkit, not even their code, the toolkit at different phases of the process to make sure that we had developers at the table. So for our stakeholder committee, we had nonprofit developers and for-profit developers who'd actually built in Marin County to say, yes, this would work. That seems a little tricky. I'm not sure it would work. The other thing is, and Bob brought this up, is that with our density bonus projects, so those are projects that receive incentives based on affordability or unit numbers, they receive concessions. So essentially they have to use the objective design standards, but then at some point they might be able to say, hey, this standard isn't penciling out for us. We want to get rid of this standard as a form of concession. And unfortunately, it changes the character of the code, but we really can't control the density bonus and concessions with the objective standards. It's just we can't do that according to state law.
Adam?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this when I was in my presentation, but we had that comment as well. And ultimately our planning commission and some of the people on our technical advisory committee felt that going and adopting the actual architectural standards did go too far. We should use those sort of as guidelines and still are very useful to sort of put out what would be sort of good design and architecture. But I think we felt like we got, and the members of the committees that we were working with and the commission felt like we got enough with the requirements of where the building was required to be placed on the lot, breaking up the massing in ways that I think Tony, you highlighted some of the ways that the mass was required to be broken up on different sites, that beyond that, there was still going to be flexibility in sort of the materiality and the sort of the feel and character that architects could use to sort of really make it their own, while still getting the town sort of a baseline level of quality that we felt was critical.
Wow. Thank you, Adam. Very last question is just came to me. We are coming at 1 minute left. So really quickly, everybody, what's one last thought you want to leave with the attendees from today's webinar about this process? It looks like, Tony, you want to go first?
Yeah, very quickly. Jillian, I think having Jillian in this process was invaluable. She was a huge glue between the county and its objectives, all the communities and their idiosyncrasies, and it's still going on, right? And then all of us. And so you made our job way easier than it would have been normally. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. I want to end this by saying something similar, and that I couldn't have done this without jurisdictions that supported the project and supported the process. So really making sure that all the jurisdictions are on the same page and have an understanding of the project is really key in order to collaborate and have an outcome that will actually be used.
Ada?
Definitely leadership, and the county really provided that leadership, and there were existing relationships. So the fact that the Marin planning directors had relationships of sitting at a table together, I think was also powerful in terms of just an ability to talk to each other, right? Super important in terms of that. And
Bob?
This may sound like doublespeak, but in terms of the toolkit itself, it's both prescriptive, but it's also flexible. So again, it's something you can work with for your community and customize.
Stefan?
Yeah, I want to underline just that the jurisdictions all really shared a common need that was sort of behind this approach, and that was really about providing housing in their communities that Ada touched on. This is the second time I've had the opportunity to try to get it pushed through a multi-jurisdictional code, and the first one I think was less successful because there was not that sort of shared goal. But that the jurisdictions would share, and I think it's an important takeaway because it's something that a lot of regions in the United States are really struggling with today.
Adam?
I would just say that we need to sort of continue this conversation and revisit Jillian and Bob and all of those throughout the county, and Stefan and Tony as well, because we need to see actually the projects built and developed pursuant to this. So it's sort of to be continued. And that's maybe a good segue to back to you there.
Thank you, Adam. That is the perfect segue. I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar. I also want to ask everyone on the webinar to virtually join me in ceremoniously conferring the award to our winner today. So running a round of virtual applause. Major kudos to everybody for this great work. And I also want to invite you all to keep the conversation going. We here at Smart Growth America, we are putting on our third annual Equity Summit, which is virtual, where we're going to talk about advancing racial equity through smart growth approaches. And then day one of the Equity Summit is going to be equitable community development, where we're going to talk about empowering communities by dismantling exclusionary zoning, supporting wealth building among historically disenfranchised communities, and prioritizing affordable, attainable housing. Just a sneak peek, the panelists during the first panel for day one will talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing in the city of Minneapolis 2040 efforts. We'll also have segregation by design as a panelist. If you all are aware, he documents the destruction of communities by highway alignments and highway realignments. So we dropped some chats, some links in the chat. Please share. Feel free to join us. It's going to be a great continuation of the conversation. And finally, we will send out the materials from today's webinar. The webinar is recorded. We'll also have a post wrap-up email where we'll ask for some feedback, or if you have any additional questions, thoughts, or concerns, you can contact myself or Jamie Zuris, and we'll drop that material in the chat as well. And keep an eye out for that wrap-up email. Again, thank you all for joining us. Another round of applause for our 2022 FBC Award winners. and the team and everybody involved. Thank you again, everybody. And that concludes our webinar for today.
Thank you.